Chapter 1. A Life Worth Saving. Crystallis, for had been forgotten by most of the galaxy, a graveyard of industry and ambition left to the icy embrace of time. Once, it was the shining jewel of humanity's expansion into the stars, its vast mineral deposits fueling the engines of progress. Now, it was a desolate wasteland, abandoned as its resources dried up and the mining corporations moved on to more lucrative ventures. For Lieutenant Mark Grayson, Crystallis, for wasn't just a station, it was a prison. He'd been assigned to this forsaken outpost as part of the Galactic Rescue Corps, a remote posting that felt more like punishment than duty. Mark suspected his superiors had sent him here to bury his promising career, a consequence of speaking out against unethical orders in a previous mission. The monotony of his days was soul-crushing. Mark spent most of his time patrolling the frozen expanse in his utility craft, his only company the hum of the engines and the occasional crackle of static from the outpost's communication system. Nights were worse, the silence so oppressive that he could almost hear his own heartbeat. On the day everything changed, Mark was running a routine scan of the northern quadrant when his ship's console emitted a sharp beep. The sound jolted him from his daze. He leaned forward, squinting at the screen. Unregistered distress signal detected, the onboard AI reported, its voice cold and mechanical. Mark straightened in his seat, his heart quickening. Distress signals were rare in this sector. The region was so remote that most vessels avoided it altogether. Source? He asked, his voice hoarse from days of disuse. Approximately 7.2 kilometers north. Signal strength is weak. Analysis suggests significant structural damage to the origin vessel. Mark's fingers danced over the controls, setting a course toward the signal. The monotony of his existence dissolved into a focused determination. As he approached the coordinates, the icy winds of Crystallis lashed against his ship, reducing visibility to mere meters. Mark activated the thermal scanner, the display lighting up with a faint heat signature. The source of the signal came into view: a sleek alien craft, half buried in the snow and ice. Its design was unlike anything Mark had seen before, its hull a seamless blend of silver and violet that seemed to ripple like liquid under the pale light of the twin moons. Smoke billowed from a gash along its side, and the faint hum of failing energy systems reached Mark's ears. Mark landed his craft a few meters away, grabbing his survival pack and weapon before stepping into the howling wind. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but he pressed on, his boots crunching against the ice as he approached the wreck. The interior of the ship was a scene of devastation. Broken consoles and shattered glass littered the floor, and the acrid smell of burning circuitry filled the air. Mark's flashlight illuminated the body of a crew member slumped over a control panel, their features obscured by a helmet. "Is anyone alive?" Mark called out, his voice echoing through the silence. A faint sound reached his ears, a soft, labored breathing. He followed it to the rear of the ship, where he found her. She lay against the wall, her bioluminescent skin flickering weakly. Patterns of glowing violet and blue pulsed across her body in erratic rhythms, a stark contrast to the dull gray of her surroundings. Blood thicker and darker than human blood pooled around her, the wound in her side deep and jagged. Mark knelt beside her, his training taking over. He activated his medkit and scanned her vitals. Species identified, Valian, the medkit's AI reported. Critical condition. Immediate intervention required. Mark frowned. Valians were rare in human-controlled space, known for their advanced technology and isolationist tendencies. What was she doing here? Her eyes fluttered open, locking onto his. They were a deep violet, filled with a mixture of pain and fear. She whispered something in her native tongue, the words incomprehensible but carrying a desperate plea. "Hang on," Mark said, his voice soft but firm. "I'm here to help." The medkit continued its analysis. Subject's physiology incompatible with standard human treatments. Blood transfusion necessary to stabilize condition. Warning: no compatible donors detected. Mark's jaw tightened. "What about me?" Analyzing. The AI paused before replying. "Partial compatibility detected. Procedure carries high risk of complications for both parties." Mark glanced at the woman, her breathing growing weaker. He didn't have time to debate the risks. "Do it," he said, confirming authorization. Proceeding with transfusion. The process was grueling. The medkit extracted Mark's blood, modified it with synthetic plasma, and infused it into the Valian woman. Mark winced as the machine drew more blood than he was comfortable with, but he didn't complain. He monitored her vitals, watching for any sign of improvement. Hours passed in tense silence. Mark's strength waned, his vision blurring, but he refused to leave her side. Finally, her breathing stabilized, and the glow of her skin grew stronger. Her eyes fluttered open, and she gazed at him with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. She whispered something, her voice weak but melodic. The translator struggled before producing a rough interpretation. Why? Save me? Mark managed a weary smile. Because no one deserves to die alone. Her expression softened, and for the first time in months, Mark felt a sense of purpose. Chapter 2. Bonds Beyond Blood. Mark woke to the steady hum of the alien ship's failing power core. His body ached from the transfusion process, and his head throbbed with fatigue. For a moment, he sat still, letting the events of the previous day replay in his mind. The alien woman Ilera, he now knew her name from fragments of her whispered speech, had survived. But the question lingered. At what cost? Mark dragged himself to his feet, rubbing his eyes as he looked toward the makeshift medical bay he'd set up within the alien vessel. Ilera lay on a cot fashioned from salvaged materials, her bioluminescent skin glowing faintly in the dim light. The once erratic patterns of her illumination now pulsed with a steady rhythm, a sign that her body was stabilizing. He approached cautiously, not wanting to disturb her. As he reached her side, her eyes fluttered open, locking onto his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice still hoarse but filled with curiosity, she murmured, "You, human?" Mark nodded, crouching beside her. "Yeah, Mark Grayson, Lieutenant, Galactic Rescue Corps." She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You gave your blood?" Mark hesitated. "You were dying. It was the only option." Her glowing eyes studied him intently, and then she said something in her native tongue. The translator struggled, piecing together fragments of meaning. "Why risk yourself?" "For me." Mark exhaled, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Because I couldn't just stand there and watch you die." Ilera's glowing pattern shifted subtly, a reaction he couldn't interpret. After a moment, she said softly, "Among my people, such actions are rare." Mark gave her a small smile. "Well, where I'm from, we call it doing the right thing." Over the next several days, Ilera's recovery progressed steadily, though it was clear she was far from fully healed. Mark divided his time between caring for her, scavenging supplies from the wreckage, and sending out distress signals in the slim hope that someone might hear them. As her strength returned, Ilera began to open up. She explained, in halting English supplemented by her translator, that she was a researcher from the Valian capital of Lyrathis. Her mission had been to study a distant star system when her ship was ambushed by raiders. The attack had left her stranded, the rest of her crew either killed or captured. They wanted technology, she explained one evening, her voice tinged with sorrow. "We do not share. So they destroyed us." Mark nodded grimly. He'd encountered raiders before, mercenaries and pirates who preyed on weaker vessels in the lawless regions of space. Their brutality knew no bounds. "I'm sorry about your crew," he said, his tone sincere. Ilera's gaze softened. "They were my family, and now I am alone." "You're not alone," Mark replied. "Not anymore." Her luminous pattern shifted again, this time brighter. He was beginning to realize that these shifts reflected her emotions. This one, he guessed, might be gratitude, perhaps something deeper. As the days turned into weeks, Mark and Ilera formed a tentative bond. They spent long hours together, sharing stories of their respective worlds. Ilera described the crystalline cities of Valia, suspended high above the planet's surface, and the breathtaking auroras that painted the skies every night. "Valians value knowledge and art above all else," she said, her voice filled with pride. "War and conflict are foreign to us." Mark chuckled bitterly. "You wouldn't survive a week on Earth then? We've been at war with ourselves since the beginning of time." Ilera tilted her head, studying him. "And yet, you risk your life for others. Perhaps your people are not so different from mine after all." Mark shrugged. leaning back against the wall. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just an exception. Alera's expression grew thoughtful, her glowing patterns shifting to a soft blue. No. You are. Remarkable. Among your kind and mine. Mark felt a warmth rise in his chest at her words. He wasn't sure what to say, so he settled for a quiet, thanks. Despite their growing camaraderie, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He began experiencing strange symptoms. Vivid dreams of alien landscapes, heightened senses that allowed him to hear the faintest whispers of the ship's failing systems, and an unexplainable pull toward Alera. He dismissed the changes at first, attributing them to fatigue or stress. But one morning, as he splashed water on his face, he noticed something strange in his reflection. His normally pale complexion now carried a faint iridescent sheen, almost imperceptible but undeniable. His brown eyes, too, seemed to have streaks of violet threading through them. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Something had changed. Later that day, Mark confronted Alera. "Alera," he began, his voice tight with tension. "Something's happening to me. I've been having these dreams. My senses are sharper. And my eyes." He trailed off, gesturing to his face. Alera's gaze dropped, her glowing patterns dimming. "I had hoped to find a solution before you noticed." Mark's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" She hesitated, then said quietly, "When you gave your blood to save me, it triggered a reaction. Your body is adapting. It carries traces of Valian traits now." Mark stared at her, his mind racing. "Adapting? What does that mean? Am I turning into you?" Alera shook her head. "No, you are still human, but your DNA now carries pieces of mine. It is why you dream of Valia, why your senses are sharper. Your body is changing." Mark's fists clenched at his sides. "And you didn't think to tell me?" "I did not want to burden you," she said, her voice trembling. "You have already given so much. I hoped I could fix it." Mark exhaled, his anger fading into resignation. "So what happens now?" Before Alera could answer, an alarm blared. The proximity sensors were picking up multiple ships descending toward the crash site. "They found us," Alera whispered, her face pale. Mark grabbed his weapon and turned to her. "Stay here. I'll handle it." "Mark, you cannot dash. Just trust me," he said, his voice firm. As he stepped out into the freezing wind, Mark felt a surge of determination. Whatever was happening to him, he would protect Alera, no matter the cost. Chapter 3. The Unseen Price. The alarms screamed through the battered alien ship, their shrill warning a jarring contrast to the frozen silence of Crystallis 4. Mark Grayson's eyes darted to the console as he tightened his grip on the rifle slung across his shoulder. The proximity scanners confirmed his worst fears. 3 ships were inbound, and they were heavily armed. Alera stood at the central control station, her glowing patterns shifting chaotically, reflecting her inner turmoil. Her hands moved rapidly over the console as she amplified the distress beacon, her desperation growing with each passing second. She turned to Mark, her luminous eyes wide with worry. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark nodded, his face set in grim determination. He'd expected this. Ever since Alera had shared her story of how raiders had ambushed her crew, slaughtering them for their advanced technology, Mark knew it was only a matter of time before they returned to finish the job. "How much time do we have?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "Minutes," she replied. "Kaler is with them." Mark's jaw tightened. He'd heard of Kaler every soldier in the outer systems had. The man was a living nightmare, ruthless warlord who commanded fear and respect in equal measure. His reputation was one of cruelty, precision, and unrelenting pursuit of his prey. "We'll make it work," Mark said, pulling his rifle from his shoulder and checking the charge. His movements were deliberate, masking the tension bubbling beneath his calm exterior. "You can't face them alone," Alera said, stepping toward him. Her glowing patterns flickered with urgency. "They'll kill you." Mark gave her a faint smile. "Then I'll make it as expensive as I can for them." "You don't understand," she pressed, her voice rising. "Kaler doesn't just kill. He breaks people. He'll destroy you." Mark met her gaze, his eyes steady. "Not if I destroy him first." Alera's patterns dimmed, her version of a frown. She hesitated before speaking again, her tone quieter. Mark, your body. It's changing. You've felt it, haven't you? The strength, the speed, it's not normal. I don't know how far it will go, but if you push yourself too hard, I'll manage, he interrupted, his voice resolute. Stay inside. Seal the ship. Keep that beacon running. Someone will hear it. Alera bit her lip, her glow flickering uncertainly. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely audible. Be careful. Mark gave her a reassuring nod before stepping out into the icy wasteland. The cold bit at his face as he moved toward the rocky outcropping near the ship, using it for cover. The roaring engines of the raider ships grew louder, the faint glow of their thrusters cutting through the blizzard. The raiders' ships landed with a thunderous roar, their sleek black hulls bristling with weapons. Snow and ice were thrown into the air as their engines powered down, and the hatches opened. One by one, the raiders disembarked, their armor pieced together from scavenged materials. Each carried a weapon, plasma rifles, blades, and makeshift explosives. Kaler emerged last, towering over his men in his imposing black armor. His plasma axe hummed with deadly energy, casting a faint glow around him. His helmet, marked with the insignia of a snarling wolf, made him look less like a man and more like a predator. Kaler's voice boomed across the plain, amplified by the speakers in his armor. Valian, I know you're in there. Come out now, and I'll make your death quick. Resist, and I'll make you beg for mercy. Mark stepped out from behind the rocks, his rifle raised. She's not going anywhere, he called, his voice steady despite the odds. The raiders turned their weapons on him, but Mark didn't flinch. Kaler tilted his head, studying the lone human. And who are you, little soldier? He asked, his tone mocking. Her protector? Or just another fool who thinks he can stop me? Mark smirked, his finger hovering over the trigger. Why don't you come and find out? Kaler chuckled, the sound low and menacing. Kill him. The first wave of raiders charged, their boots crunching through the snow as they rushed toward Mark. He waited until they were within range before firing, his enhanced reflexes allowing him to line up precise shots. His plasma bolts struck true, disarming and disabling two of the attackers in quick succession. The third raider lunged at him with a blade, but Mark sidestepped smoothly, driving the butt of his rifle into the man's ribs. The raider crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. Mark spun around to face the next attacker, his movements fluid and precise. Inside the ship, Alera watched through a viewport, her glowing patterns shifting wildly. She had seen warriors before, but Mark was different. His speed, his accuracy, it was almost as if he were moving on instinct, his body reacting faster than his mind could process. Kaler watched the skirmish with mild amusement. Interesting, he muttered, but let's see how far you can go. He gestured to his elite guard, four heavily armed raiders who moved with the precision of seasoned soldiers. They advanced on Mark, their weapons trained on him. Mark gritted his teeth, his muscles already beginning to ache. The changes in his physiology had given him an edge, but the strain was starting to show. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as the elite guard closed in. The fight was brutal. The elite guard attacked in unison, their coordinated strikes forcing Mark onto the defensive. He dodged and parried as best he could, using the terrain to create distance. Chapter 4. A New Beginning. Mark's body ached in ways he had never experienced before. Every muscle screamed for rest, and his lungs burned as if he had run for miles in Crystallis 4's frigid atmosphere. But exhaustion was a distant concern compared to the overwhelming relief of hearing the raider ships retreat into the atmosphere. He opened his eyes to find himself inside the alien vessel, the faint hum of its failing systems a familiar background noise. Alera knelt beside him, her glowing bioluminescent patterns subdued but steady. She had wrapped him in a thermal blanket, her hands hovering over a medical console that beeped softly as it scanned his injuries. "You're awake," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and worry. Mark managed a weak smile. "That's debatable." Alera didn't laugh. Instead, she studied him with a seriousness that sent a chill down his spine, far colder than the planet's icy winds. "You're not fine, Mark. Whatever this transformation is, it's accelerating. The fight pushed you too far. He propped himself up on one elbow, wincing as pain flared through his ribs. I didn't have much of a choice, did I? They weren't exactly going to leave us alone. Her glowing patterns dimmed, the alien equivalent of a frown. You shouldn't have had to face them alone. She hesitated, her gaze dropping. I'm sorry. For what? He asked, his tone soft despite his exhaustion. You didn't send those raiders after us. No, she admitted, her voice trembling, but I brought you into this mess. And now, she gestured to the console, where a holographic representation of Mark's vitals floated. His DNA was displayed as a complex double helix, but parts of it shimmered with faint violet strands markers of Valiant integration. Your body is changing because of me. Mark stared at the display, the reality of his situation settling over him like a heavy weight. What does it mean? He asked finally. Alara hesitated. I don't know. Your physiology is adapting in ways I've never seen before. You're stronger, faster, but these changes aren't sustainable. If this continues, your body might not survive. The room fell silent, save for the hum of the ship's systems. Mark leaned back, closing his eyes. The memories of the fight flashed through his mind, the way his reflexes had heightened, how his body had moved as if guided by instinct. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. How much time do I have? He asked. I can't say, Alara replied. Days, maybe weeks. But there's hope. If we can reach my homeworld, Valia, our researchers might be able to stabilize your condition. Mark opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. Then let's not waste time. The journey to Valia. Repairing the ship took another 2 days. The raider attack had damaged key systems, and Alara worked tirelessly to patch them together. Mark did what he could to help, but his body was slow to recover from the strain of battle. He felt the changes more acutely now, his senses sharper, his strength returning faster than it should. But with each surge of power came a bone-deep fatigue that left him reeling. You shouldn't push yourself, Alara said one evening as she caught him struggling to lift a replacement power cell into place. I'm fine, he replied, though his trembling hands betrayed him. You're not, she countered, stepping closer. She gently took the cell from him, her touch sending a faint warmth through his body. Please, let me handle this. You've done enough. Mark reluctantly stepped back, leaning against the wall. I'm not used to sitting on the sidelines. Alara gave him a faint smile, her glowing patterns softening. Then consider this a lesson in patience. By the time the ship was operational, they had used almost every scrap of salvageable material from the wreck. The vessel was still a far cry from its original state, but it was enough to get them off Crystal Lease, for and on course for Valia. As the ship broke through the planet's atmosphere, Mark stared out the viewport, watching the icy landscape fade into the blackness of space. Alara stood beside him, her expression unreadable. Do you think they'll accept me? He asked, breaking the silence. Alara turned to him, her glowing eyes meeting his. They'll have no choice. You saved me. That alone will speak volumes to my people. And if they don't care? Her patterns shifted, glowing brighter for a moment. Then I'll make them care. Arrival at Valia. The journey to Valia took 3 standard days. During that time, Mark and Alara grew closer. They shared stories of their respective worlds, their cultures, and the lives they had left behind. For Mark, it was a chance to rediscover a sense of purpose beyond survival. For Alara, it was an opportunity to see humanity through his eyes, its flaws, its resilience, and its capacity for compassion. When they finally arrived, Valia took Mark's breath away. The planet was a jewel of light and color, its atmosphere shimmering with auroras that danced across the skies. Vast crystalline cities floated above the surface, connected by shimmering bridges of energy. The sight was both alien and awe-inspiring. The ship docked at a platform high above the capital city of Lyrathis. Alara guided Mark through the bustling streets, where Valians stopped to stare at the human walking among them. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to suspicion, but no one dared to approach. At the heart of the city stood the council hall, a towering structure made entirely of translucent crystal. Inside, Alara presented Mark to the Council of Elders, a group of dignified Valians whose glowing patterns shifted in unison as they deliberated. You bring a human to Valia, one elder said, his tone neutral. Why? He saved my life, Ilara replied, her voice steady. And in doing so, his body has begun to change. He needs our help. The council exchanged glances, their patterns flickering with uncertainty. A human adapting to Valian physiology. It is unprecedented. It is also irreversible, Ilara said. If we do nothing, he will die. The room fell silent. Mark stood beside her, his gaze steady despite the weight of their judgment. Finally, one of the elders spoke. Very well. We will do what we can. The price of survival. The following days were a whirlwind of tests, scans, and treatments. Valian scientists worked tirelessly to understand Mark's condition, their fascination tempered by the urgency of his situation. Ilara stayed by his side, her presence a constant source of comfort. The treatments were grueling, pushing Mark's body to its limits as the scientists worked to stabilize his DNA. At times, the pain was unbearable, but he endured it without complaint. Ilara's hand in his was all the encouragement he needed. "You're stronger than I expected," she said one evening as they sat together in the medical bay. Mark chuckled weakly. "I've had good motivation." Her patterns glowed softly, a faint blush crossing her features. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has, Mark. I won't let you go through this alone." A new legacy. After weeks of treatments, the scientists finally succeeded in stabilizing Mark's condition. His body was no longer at war with itself, though the changes remained. He was stronger, faster, and more attuned to his surroundings than any human had ever been. But more than that, he felt connected to Ilara, to Valia, to something greater than himself. As he stood on a balcony overlooking the city, Ilara joined him, her glowing patterns shifting in soft, soothing waves. "You've become a part of us," she said, her voice filled with quiet awe. "And you've become a part of me," Mark replied, turning to face her. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of everything they had endured settling between them. Then, Ilara reached out, her hand brushing against his. "This isn't just the end of your journey, Mark. It's the beginning of ours." Mark smiled, his grip tightening around hers. Together, they looked out over the shimmering city, the auroras painting the sky in colors that spoke of hope and a future neither of them could have imagined.